My name is Sarah. I'm 28 years old, and I work as an electrician. Not the kind of job that impresses people at dinner parties. Not the kind of job my sister-in-law ever let me forget. Last Thanksgiving, my brother Daniel invited the whole family to his house for the holiday. His wife, Claudia, had been planning it for weeks. New furniture, catered food, a guest list that included her boss and several of her colleagues from the marketing firm where she worked. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to look impressive. I arrived a little late because I had just finished a job across town. I still had a small grease mark on my left wrist that I hadn't completely scrubbed off. I wore clean clothes, nothing fancy, just dark jeans and a simple blouse. I carried a pie I had baked the night before. It wasn't store-bought. I had made it from scratch, the way our mom used to make it every year. Claudia opened the door before I even knocked. She looked at me from head to toe the way she always did. That slow, polite scan that wasn't really polite at all. Then she smiled the way people smile when they're performing kindness rather than feeling it. "Sarah," she said, "you made it." I handed her the pie. She thanked me and immediately passed it to someone behind her without looking at it again. The house was warm and loud. Relatives were scattered across the living room, the kitchen, the back porch. The smell of roasted turkey filled every corner. Claudia had done a beautiful job with the decorations. Deep orange flowers on the table, small candles everywhere, cloth napkins folded into little shapes beside each plate. It was the kind of Thanksgiving spread you'd see on a magazine cover. I found a quiet corner near the window and said hello to a few cousins. My brother Daniel appeared and gave me a hug. He looked happy, a little tired, but happy. I was glad for him. Then I noticed a man I didn't recognize standing near the fireplace. He was in his early 60s, silver hair, wearing a dark blazer over a simple shirt. He held a glass of sparkling water and spoke quietly with Claudia's mother. He didn't look like family. He looked like someone important, the kind of important that doesn't need to announce itself. Before I could wonder more about him, Claudia appeared in the center of the room and tapped a small bell she had placed on the mantel. "Everyone," she called cheerfully. "Dinner is ready. Let's gather at the table." The room slowly reorganized itself. People moved toward the long dining table, which was set for 14. I found my seat near the far end, between my cousin Marcus and an empty chair. I unfolded my napkin and reached for the water pitcher. Claudia stood at the head of the table beside Daniel. She looked radiant in her cream-colored dress, her hair perfectly arranged, her smile wide and in control of everything. She raised her glass. "I just want to say how grateful I am to have everyone here," she began. "This house feels full of love today." She paused for effect. "And since we have a few new faces at the table, I thought it would be nice to do a quick round of introductions. Just say your name and what you do." People went around the table. Claudia's boss introduced himself as a senior vice president at a national brand company. Her colleague mentioned a recent campaign that had won an industry award. Her college friend talked about opening a second yoga studio in Austin. Each introduction felt less like a conversation and more like a resume reading. When it got to me, I kept it simple. "I'm Sarah," I said. "Daniel's sister. I'm an electrician." There was a small pause, not dramatic. Just the kind of pause that happens when a room recalibrates. Claudia laughed lightly from the other end of the table. "An electrician," she repeated, drawing the word out just long enough to make it sound like a punchline. She looked around the table with a small smile. "Daniel's little sister fixes wires for a living." She shrugged playfully. "Every family needs one, I suppose." A few people smiled politely. Someone let out a short, awkward chuckle. My brother looked down at his plate. I didn't respond. I picked up my fork and focused on the food in front of me. But then something shifted. The man near the fireplace, who had taken the seat directly across from me, he wasn't smiling, he wasn't frowning, he was looking at me the way someone looks when they're trying to place a face they've seen before in a completely different context. Focused, still. Like the rest of the table noise, had gone quiet in his mind. I noticed it but said nothing. I assumed he would look away in a moment. He didn't. The dinner continued. Plates were passed, conversations broke into smaller groups, someone brought up football and half the table shifted that direction. The turkey was carved, the sides were served, and Claudia refilled glasses with the kind of graceful efficiency that told you she had rehearsed all of this in her head many times. But the man across from me kept glancing over. Not constantly, not intrusively, just returning to me every few minutes with that same quiet concentration. Claudia's colleague leaned toward him at one point and said something that made him nod, but his eyes drifted back toward me almost immediately afterward. My cousin Marcus whispered, "Do you know that guy?" "No," I said, quietly. "Never seen him before." About 30 minutes into dinner, the man set his fork down. He folded his hands on the table and looked at me directly. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was calm, measured. "I don't mean to be rude, but have we met before?" The nearby conversation slowed slightly. I shook my head. "I don't think so." "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name during introductions." "Gerald," he said. "Gerald Whitmore." The name didn't mean anything to me. I told him so honestly. He nodded slowly, still thinking. "What part of the city do you work in?" "All over," I said. "Commercial, residential. Wherever the job is." He rubbed the side of his jaw. "Do you ever work in the Riverside district?" Something in my memory stirred, but I couldn't connect it to anything specific yet. I nodded carefully. "I've had jobs out there, yes." He exhaled through his nose, looked down, then looked back up again. "Strange," he said, more to himself than to me. Claudia, who had been monitoring every conversation at the table with quiet efficiency, spoke up from her end with a bright smile. "Gerald, Sarah fixes electrical wiring. I doubt your paths have crossed professionally." She said it warmly, but the meaning underneath was clear. Different worlds, don't waste your curiosity. Gerald looked at Claudia briefly, then back at me. He said nothing for a moment. Then he picked up his fork again and returned to his plate, but I could see it in the way he held himself. He wasn't done thinking. He was just doing it quietly. The meal stretched on. Dessert came out. Someone brought my pie to the table, and I noticed Claudia hesitate for just a second when she saw it was homemade. She placed it at the far end and made sure the store-bought pecan tart was front and center. I wasn't keeping score. I never did with Claudia. Some people need to arrange the world in a certain order to feel safe in it. I had stopped trying to understand that about her years ago. After dessert, people drifted back into loose groups. Some moved toward the living room, others stepped outside onto the porch with coffee. I was helping carry empty plates toward the kitchen when Gerald appeared in the hallway. He was holding his phone, and he was staring at the screen with an expression I can only describe as recognition breaking open. He looked up when he heard me. "Sarah," he said. Not a question. A confirmation. I set the plates on the kitchen counter and turned toward him. "I remembered," he said. His voice was different now. Quieter, more careful. Like he was handling something fragile. 2 years ago. The Meridian Tower Project. Riverside District. I went still. Because I remembered the Meridian Tower. "There was a fire," he said slowly. "An electrical fault in the east corridor on the 9th floor. It was a Saturday. Almost no one was supposed to be in the building." My chest tightened. He continued. "But I was there. I had gone in early that morning to finish a report before a board presentation on Monday. I was on the 9th floor, in the conference room, alone. When the fire alarm went off, I assumed it was a drill." He paused. I didn't move right away. I remembered. I remembered that morning very clearly. I had been brought in by the building management company to complete an inspection on the East Corridor circuits before the building opened for business the following week. I arrived at 7 in the morning. The corridor was dark and quiet. I had my tools laid out, my checklist running, when I smelled something that didn't belong. Not electrical burn exactly. Something older. Something that had been building for a while inside the wall cavity. I called it in immediately. Then I started moving through the floor, knocking on every door, checking every room. The conference room at the end of the hall had been the last one. Gerald was standing at the window when I opened the door. He had his laptop open. He had earbuds in. He hadn't heard the alarm at all. "You came through that door," Gerald said, "standing now in my brother's hallway 2 years later, and you told me I needed to move. Immediately. Not in a minute. Not after I packed my things." Right then, I remembered the look on his face when I found him. Surprised. A little annoyed, actually. He had reached back toward his laptop. I had put my hand on the doorframe and said, very clearly, that there was no time. He had looked at me for 1 second, and something in my voice or my expression must have reached him, because he stood up and followed me without another word. We were in the stairwell when the east corridor filled with smoke. By the time we reached the lobby, the fire department had arrived. The 9th-floor east corridor was gutted. The investigation later found that degraded insulation in the wall cavity had been smoldering for days before it finally caught. If he had stayed another 4 or 5 minutes, the smoke alone would have been a serious problem. Gerald looked at me in the hallway with an expression I didn't know how to describe. It was more than gratitude. It was the look of someone who had occasionally wondered, over the past 2 years, who the person was that had come through that door. "I filed a report afterward," he said. "I tried to find out who the electrician on that job was. The building management company changed contractors partway through the project, and the records were a mess. I was told it was a subcontracted crew, and the individual worker information wasn't available." He shook his head slightly. "I never found out." He looked at me steadily. "Until right now." I didn't know what to say. I told him honestly that I had just been doing my job, that any electrician would have done the same walkthrough. He shook his head. "You didn't have to check those rooms," he said. "The fire was already called in. You could have walked to the stairwell yourself and left. You stayed and made sure the floor was clear." I looked down at the kitchen counter for a moment. I wasn't used to this. Being seen this way, named this way. "You really saved my life," he said. "I want you to know I understand that." We stood in the hallway for a moment longer. Then Gerald straightened up and said, quietly, that he needed to share something with the room. I asked him not to make it a big deal. He gave me a look that said he was going to make it exactly as big a deal as it was. We walked back out together. The living room had settled into a comfortable after-dinner hum. Claudia was laughing at something her colleague said near the fireplace. Daniel was on the couch with a cup of coffee. A few people were looking at their phones, winding down. Gerald moved to the center of the room. He didn't tap a glass or raise his voice. He simply stood there with a stillness that made people naturally stop what they were doing and look at him. "I want to say something," he said, "before the evening ends." The room came to attention. Claudia turned from the fireplace. "I've been trying to figure out for the past hour where I knew Sarah from," he said. He let that land for a moment. "I remembered during dessert." He looked at me. 2 years ago, Sarah was working a job at Meridian Tower in the Riverside district. On a Saturday morning when the building was nearly empty, she discovered a fire before the alarm system fully activated. She could have evacuated immediately. He paused. Instead, she went door to door on the 9th floor to make sure no one was still inside. The room was very quiet. "I was in a conference room with my earbuds in," he said. "I had no idea what was happening. Sarah opened that door and got me out of the building." He looked around the room steadily. The east corridor was fully engulfed about 5 minutes after we reached the lobby. Someone near the couch exhaled. Claudia had stopped smiling. She was standing very still near the fireplace, her wine glass held at her side. Gerald turned toward her direction. "You introduced Sarah earlier as someone who fixes wires for a living," he said. His voice wasn't harsh. It was simply precise, the way a person speaks when they want to be clearly understood. "I want you to know that the person who fixes wires is the same person who understood what a burning wire inside a wall meant before the building knew it was on fire. And that knowledge is why I'm standing here tonight." The silence stretched. Claudia's colleague looked at the floor. Her boss, the senior vice president, was watching Gerald with an expression of careful attention. My brother Daniel had set down his coffee cup. He was looking at me in a way he hadn't looked at me in a very long time, like he was seeing something he should have already known was there. Gerald looked back at me one final time. "Thank you," he said simply. "I've wanted to say that to you for 2 years." I nodded. I could feel my face going warm. I was never good at being thanked. I told him again that it was just the job, that any professional would have done the same walkthrough. But his expression said he didn't entirely agree with that. The room slowly came back to life. People started talking again, but in quieter voices. A few people looked at me differently as they moved past. My cousin Marcus came over and stood beside me without saying anything, which was somehow exactly right. Claudia's boss walked over to Gerald, and I caught the end of their conversation. Something about the Meridian Tower project, about construction safety protocols. Gerald answered his questions with that same measured calm. Claudia herself did not come over to me for the rest of the evening. I wasn't looking for an apology. I want to be honest about that. I hadn't been keeping a list of every small comment she'd made over the years, waiting for a moment to see her proven wrong. That's not how I live. My job has taught me that the most important things happen quietly, inside walls, underneath floors, in the spaces people never think to look. You don't do that work for recognition. You do it because it matters. Because when something goes wrong in those hidden places, dues.com, the consequences are real. But I would be lying if I said something didn't shift in me that evening. Not because of Gerald's words, exactly, though those meant more to me than I was comfortable showing. It was something else. It was the moment I caught Daniel's eyes across the room and he gave me the smallest nod, the kind of nod that doesn't need any words behind it. He had grown up watching Claudia slowly reshape his understanding of who mattered and who didn't. I had watched it happen over years. Small comments, light laughter, the kind of dismissal that never quite breaks the surface enough for anyone to call it out. That nod told me he was awake again. Later, when most of the guests had left and the house had gone quiet, Daniel found me in the kitchen. I was wrapping up the leftover slices of my pie. Most of it had been eaten after all. Claudia's pecan tart had barely been touched. Daniel leaned against the counter beside me. "I'm sorry," he said. I didn't ask him to explain what he was sorry for. I didn't need the list. I handed him a wrapped slice of pie. "Come visit me sometime," I said. "I'll show you the job I'm starting in February. New community center over on Hartwell. Big project." He took the pie. He smiled. "I like that," he said. I drove home that night through quiet streets. The city was partly lit, partly dark, and I thought about the things people decide are worth knowing about and the things they don't. Electricity is invisible until it isn't. Until it's keeping every light on in a building, or until it's burning through a wall in silence, waiting. The work is real even when no one sees it. I've always known that. But sometimes it helps when somebody else says it out loud. I used to think that being overlooked was just the cost of doing work that happens inside walls, underneath floors, in places no one thinks about until something goes wrong. For most of my life, I accepted that. I showed up, I did the job, and I went home. I didn't need a dinner table full of people to understand the value of what I did. But that Thanksgiving changed something in me. Not because Gerald stood up and said the things he said, though I will carry those words for a long time. It changed something because of what I saw happen in the room right after he finished speaking. Every action has a consequence that travels further than we can see in the moment we take it. When Claudia laughed and reduced me to a punchline, she wasn't just making a small joke at a family dinner. She was making a choice about how she treated people she had decided didn't matter. And that choice had been building for years, small comment after small comment, in front of my brother, in front of relatives, in front of people whose respect she was always trying to manage. What she didn't understand is that the people we dismiss most casually are often the ones who have moved quietly through the world doing things that actually hold it together. I didn't plan for Gerald to be at that table. I didn't know him. I hadn't thought about that Saturday morning at Meridian Tower as anything other than a job. I did the way I always do my job, carefully, thoroughly, with attention to the things other people walk past without noticing. That is not a heroic quality. It is simply a trained one. It is what happens when you take your work seriously enough to develop real skill and real judgment over time. Intelligence isn't only what you studied in school. It's the kind of understanding you build slowly, through repetition and care and showing up even when no one is watching. What I keep thinking about is this. The version of me who half-heartedly walked that corridor, who evacuated herself and trusted the system to handle the rest, would have been a perfectly reasonable person. No one would have blamed her, but she also would not have opened that conference room door. And a man would have sat at a window with his earbuds in, not knowing that the air around him was already changing. Resilience is not about surviving the dramatic moments. It's about the steady practice of doing things well in the ordinary ones. It's about developing the discipline to care about your work on a Tuesday morning when the building is empty and no one will ever know whether you cut a corner or didn't. The character we build in those invisible moments is the only character we actually have. Everything else is performance. When Daniel nodded at me across the room that evening, I understood something I hadn't let myself fully feel in years. The people who love us can lose their way for a while. They can be slowly shaped by the people around them into seeing the world through a narrower lens. But underneath that, something truer usually remains. And sometimes it just needs one honest moment to come back to the surface. I drove home with a wrapped slice of pie on the passenger seat and the city lights going past the window, and I thought about how long the work had been worth doing before anyone said so out loud. The answer, of course, was always. It was always worth it. That part was never in question. The only thing that changed that night was that somebody else finally knew it too.